Nickelodeon presents Good Burger 2 Go, written by Steve Holland and based on a story by Dan Schneider. Welcome to Good Burger, home of the Good Burger. Can I take your order? From behind his dingy fast food counter, the young employee stared at his customer through large brown eyes. The customer stared back at him from behind the thick pair of bifocals that balanced precariously at the end of his pointed nose. His bald and ancient face hung slack with an expression of shock and horror. The Good Burger employee was used to this look. He could handle it. He was calm. He was cool. His name was Ed, and he wasn't wearing any pants. I'm Bernie Kibitz, and you aren't wearing any pants. The customer spit the last word from between his wrinkled and angry lips. Bernie Kibitz was a very angry man. Bernie Kibitz was also a very old man. And if there was one thing that Bernie Kibitz had learned in all of his many old and angry years, it was that fast food employees should always be wearing pants. He pushed his glasses back up on top of his pointy nose, rubbed his bald head with his other hand, and waited impatiently for an answer. Look, dude, can one help you or not? Was Ed's confused reply. Yes, you can help me. Why do you suppose Bernie is standing here in front of you? To be helped, that's why. And first you can help me by putting on some pants. Now. While Ed was not, at the moment, wearing pants, his backside was, in fact, covered by the bright, burger-covered boxer shorts that he often wore. This didn't seem to appease Bernie in the least. After all, the last thing that Bernie Kibitz wanted at this point in his angry old life was to be served food by a guy who wasn't wearing any pants. Ed began singing to himself during the pause in the conversation. I'm a dude, he's a dude, she's a dude, 'cause we're all dudes, hey. It was his favorite song. Actually, it was the only song he knew, but somehow he never tired of singing it. Second verse, same as the first verse. I'm a dude, he's a dude. As he sang, he began drumming wildly with his hands, first on the counter, then the cash register. Finally, as he reached the rousing third verse, same as the first, on Bernie's bald and wrinkled head. Why? Shouted Bernie, slamming his shiny black cane onto Good Burger's dingy floor for effect. I'm Bernie Kibitz, and my head is not to be used as a drum by some crazy young hooligan. Bernie's face was red and scrunched up in that really angry way that only seemed to happen at Good Burger, and then, only when Ed was behind the counter. Ed stopped drumming and stared at Bernie's sweat-covered face with a look of understanding and sympathy. He pulled the microphone to his face and said in his most understanding tone, Welcome to Good Burger, home of the Good Burger. Can I take your order? Bernie's face turned bright red, then reconsidered, and instead turned a far angrier shade of purple. Even his wrinkles looked angry. You make me so angry. That does it. Bernie Kibitz has had enough. I'm leaving this place and going to some place where the young people wear trousers. And with that, Bernie turned, balanced his frail old frame on his cane, and stormed out. Whoa! What's his problem? Ed wondered aloud as Bernie slammed the door behind him. The elderly can be so touchy. Spatch, Good Burger's grease-stained fry cook, shrugged his huge shoulders and grunted. Spatch was far bigger than a fast food employee ought to be, weighing in at a thick and muscular 300 pounds. He was also far greasier than a fast food employee ought to be. His white cook's uniform and apron were smeared with greasy brown stains, and he grunted far more than a fast food employee ought to grunt. In fact, grunts were all he ever said. If you said a friendly good morning to Spatch, you could expect to be answered with a grunt. If you were to comment on what a lovely grease-stained apron he was wearing, you would be answered with a grunt. And if you happened to mention that you couldn't understand a single thing Spatch said, and couldn't he for once not grunt but answer like a normal human being, you would probably be answered with a grunt, and then pounded into the ground. The next customer in line stepped up to the counter, took one look at Ed without his pants, screamed, and ran from the building. Ed didn't seem to mind at all. Thanks for coming. Have a nice day, he yelled after the fleeing customer. Dexter Reed was used to hearing people scream in Good Burger. Since he'd started working there almost a year ago, The sound of customers screaming and running from the building had become a daily occurrence. He also knew the reason why they screamed. He could sum it up with one simple word. Ed. Dexter and Ed had become fast friends since the day they'd met. Dexter had just been fired from his new job at Mondo Burger and was trying to drown his sorrows at the bottom of several milkshakes when Ed had first spotted him. And although Ed had seemed a little odd at first, he did get Dexter a new job right there at Good Burger. He had even helped him get back at the Mondo Burger jerks who had fired him and made fun of him. Dexter owed a lot to Ed. He knew that underneath Ed's unique exterior was a true friend. And that was why every day when a new customer screamed and ran, Dexter would rush from behind the fry bins to the counter and say, "Ed, what have you done now?" And every day Ed would turn to him with a happy grin and reply, "Welcome to Good Burger, home of the Good Burger. Can I take your order?" "No, man, you can't take my order. I work here," Dexter explained, his friendly face cocked at a curious angle. "Oh yeah, cool." Ed bobbed his head from side to side, setting his chin-length dreadlocks swinging back and forth in front of his large, gap-toothed grin. Dexter looked him up and down. "Ed, where are your pants?" "Probably at home in my pants drawer, with all my other pants." Ed was not always the brightest bulb in the bunch. "Why?" asked Dexter, his boyish features squinting in a desperate effort to understand, "So I'll know where to find them." Duh. To Ed, it all seemed perfectly logical. Unfortunately, it was a logic that no one else in the world seemed to understand. Dexter had long ago given up trying. "Ed, you can't let Mr. Bailey see you like this. Now hurry up and find some pants. He's on his way here." Mr. Bailey was Good Burger's manager. He was the man who had hired Ed, and who every day since had struggled to remember exactly why. Not that Ed was always a problem. Sure, he sometimes annoyed the customers. Sure, he occasionally liked to take baths in the milkshake machine. And sure, he single-handedly caused 6 of Mr. Bailey's 7 ulcers to ache almost constantly. But it was also Ed who invented the special sauce that saved Good Burger from near ruin when the Mondo Burger across the street threatened to destroy them. At Good Burger, Ed was a hero. And so Mr. Bailey would put up with the headaches and the sharp stomach pains and the even sharper chest pains that acted up every time Ed was near. He'd put up with it, but that didn't mean that he had to like it. Dexter and the other Good Burger employees tried to spare Mr. Bailey the agony whenever they could. They were used to Ed's little peculiarities, and they had worked out a system to spare Mr. Bailey any additional pain. It went something like this. A. Customer screams. B. Dexter rushes to the front and identifies Ed's problem. In this case, no pants. C. He motions to Fizz, the pasty white drive-thru boy, who quickly gets rid of customer at drive-thru window, usually by dumping food on them. D. Fizz opens a cabinet marked emergency, open only in case of Eddie. He searches through the contents until he finds what he's looking for, i.e., pants. E. He tosses pants to Dexter, who holds them open. Spatch lifts Ed straight up off the ground and sets him down again, inside the fresh new pair of trousers. F. Ed, Fizz, and Spatch breathe a sigh of relief. Ed looked around and tugged at his new pants just as Mr. Bailey walked in through the door. There were a few words usually used to describe Mr. Bailey. Good-natured usually sprang to mind. Manager often topped the list. But the words that were spoken about Mr. Bailey most often were these: amazingly panicked. Mr. Bailey entered the store in a panic. A crumpled note was clenched tightly in one hand. Nothing was clenched in the other, but the hand was clenched anyway. His brown manager's uniform was only slightly less rumpled than the tangle of curly brown hair that topped his face. "Good Burger employees, gather round, please. I have an announcement." His eyes darted to Ed suspiciously. Ed grinned and bobbed his head innocently. Mr. Bailey gave a surprised shrug and said, "Nice pants, Ed." "Oh, they're not mine. Spatch put them on me." The manager's brow furrowed in confusion. It was an expression he was used to, and often his face would just resort to it out of sheer habit. He shook it off after all. He had an important announcement to make, and he didn't want to waste time by talking to Ed. "Good Burger people, I have an announcement to make, but I don't want anyone to panic," he stated in his most panicked voice. "Panicking won't solve the problem, so let's just not do it." His voice dropped into a lower and even more panicky tone. The Good Burger employees were used to their manager's moods, and they'd come prepared. Dexter gave a slight nod to Fizz, who pulled a brightly colored bottle from his pocket. He offered it to Mr. Bailey. "Antacid, it'll help soothe your stomach." Mr. Bailey gratefully took the bottle, shook one of the antacid tablets into his mouth, and chewed. His stomach rumbled a happy rumble of relief. "Now, as I was saying, we have been fined, ticketed if you will, by NASCORFs." Everyone looked confused except Ed, who nodded along as if he understood. He didn't. Dexter sheepishly stuck his hand into the air. NASCORFs?" Mr. Bailey tried to answer calmly. He failed. "Yes, NASCORFs, the National Association of Sauces, Creams, and Other Random Foodstuffs. NASCORFs. Oh yeah, of course, the National Association of, stuffs." Dexter had no idea what Mr. Bailey was talking about. The National Association of Sauces, Creams, and Other Random Foodstuffs. They're called NASCORFs for short. It's the government agency that regulates restaurants and their use of sauces, creams. Dexter caught on. "And other random foodstuffs. Yeah, I got it. But what do they want with us?" The others joined in, mumbling along curiously. Spatch offered a questioning grunt. "Well, from this note I have clenched here in my fist, it looks like we're being fined for selling unlicensed Ed sauce." The employees gasped collectively, all except for Ed, who spoke up calmly. "Oh, don't worry. The sauce doesn't need a license. I almost never let it drive." Somewhere deep inside Mr. Bailey's gut, a brand new ulcer started to ache. He rubbed his tummy gently, trying to make the pain go away, then fought hard to regain his calm, which was a losing battle since he never really had any calm to regain. NASCORFs is sending their inspector by sometime in the next couple of days to test the sauce and make sure it meets all sauce safety specifications. They're really cracking down on sauces these days. It was Fizz who piped in. He was relatively knowledgeable on the subject of sauce and sauce inspections. In fact, he had just read an article in Fast Food Today magazine entitled, "NASCORFs, They're Really Cracking Down on Sauces These Days." He read the article a total of 9 times. "What if the sauce doesn't get licensed?" Dexter asked with more than a little concern in his voice. This was the question that kept Mr. Bailey up at night, the one that kept his medical bills so high and his supply of Antacid so low. This was the question that really scared him. His face turned red and swelled up slightly with panic as he answered, "Then no more Ed's sauce, and you know what that means." He didn't really expect an answer, but Ed offered one anyway. No. "No more Good Burger," Mr. Bailey blurted out. There was silence. No one spoke, no one grunted, no one made rude and inappropriate body noises. Mr. Bailey's face seemed to deflate ever so slightly as his cheeks returned to their normal pink shade. Ed finally broke the silence. "Woo." It was a sentiment that everyone seemed to share. Chapter 2. Night fell across the giant plastic burger that sat atop the plain, average building that housed America's most plain and average fast food restaurant. The pink neon sign that announced to the world that this was the home of the Good Burger clicked off, and the whole building lay dark and silent. Everyone had gone home for the night. Well, almost everyone. Ed sat on a small stool on Good Burger's plain, flat roof. Above him, the stars shone brightly down on the small town of Dulmont. In front of him, his fishing pole stuck out of his hands exactly like a fishing pole should. Ed pulled a cold French fry from the Good Fries container next to him. He found the hook at the end of the fishing line and baited it with the fry, then cast the line over the side of the building. He sat back on his stool and waited. Ed knew that fishing was a game for the patient, and he could outweight a fish any day of the week. Dexter pulled himself over the edge of the roof and panted, out of breath. He knew Ed would be up there. It was where he always came to think, or to do whatever it was Ed did in place of thinking. Ed, what are you doing? Oh, hey Dexter, I'm fishing. Wanna join me? Dexter briefly thought about trying to explain to Ed why he couldn't fish off the top of a building, then decided against it. Ed was his friend, and if fishing off the top of a building made him happy, then that was fine with Dexter. Even if it was really, really strange. He walked over to Ed and stood next to him, craning his neck to see over the edge of the building where Ed's French fry-baited hook dangled below, swaying gently in the cool night breeze. Catch anything? Dexter reached into his pocket and pulled out his yo-yo. It was something he always did when he was worried. Somehow, watching the yo-yo roll up and down off his finger helped him relax. Nah, I've been fishing up here for 2 years and I haven't caught anything yet, except once when it was winter and I caught a cold. Dexter smiled. Ed could always cheer him up. He rolled the yo-yo over his fingers and let it dangle at the end of its line for just a minute, before a flick of his wrist sent it jumping right back into his hand. Here, fishy, 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 Ed began to chant. Come to Mr. French Fry. Mr. French Fry wants to meet Mr. Fish. Here, fishy. Dexter tried to break in. Ed, I don't think... But before he could finish, Ed's line snapped tight and his pole lurched forward, roughly yanking him off his stool. Dexter stared at him in shock as Ed fought with his line, pole bending furiously as he struggled to reel in his mysterious catch. It's a big un! Ed yelled excitedly, pulling hard on his pole. Dexter, I got a big one! He arched back on the rod and reeled in his catch. He held it proudly in front of him. It was a big fish, just like he said, a couple of feet from head to tail. Dexter blinked. He blinked again. He shook his head from side to side fast, then slow, then fast again. He rubbed his eyes with the palms of his hands. Nope. His eyes weren't lying to him. Ed had actually caught a fish off the top of Good Burger. Dexter couldn't believe it. He rushed to the edge of the building and looked down at the street below. The fish truck was still sitting at the stoplight, right below Dexter. Its large bed was piled high with raw fish. The light turned green, and the fish truck pulled away, one fish lighter than when it had stopped. Dexter started to laugh. He clutched his sides for support. Ed was the only person he knew who could actually catch a fish off the edge of a building. Okay, so sure, he actually snagged the fish out of the back of a passing fish truck. But what did that matter? Whoa, check out my fish. It's all... Ed searched for just the right word. Fishy. Dexter managed to calm his laughing long enough to compliment his friend on what a fine fish he had caught. Ed smiled at his fish and dropped it into the rusty metal bucket that he kept on hand just in case. He was feeling good. He stretched out on Good Burger's hard, flat roof and lay there, staring up at the night sky. He loved looking at the stars. He didn't understand what they were, but he guessed that they were something like Christmas lights. You know, if you look real hard, some of the stars start to look like stuff. He pointed up at one of the brighter stars. That one looks like a French fry. He pointed to another group of stars. And those look like Good Burgers. And those over there, they look like my armpit. Dexter stared hard at the stars Ed was pointing to, and he had to admit, they did look a little like Ed's finger. Ed got a faraway look in his eye, and he pointed at one more star. You see that one right there? Dexter tried to follow his finger. You mean that kind of bluish one? No, Ed corrected him. The one next to it. Do you see it? Dexter spotted it. Yeah, I see it. Me too, said Ed, then added, wah, just for good measure. Dexter turned and looked at his friend. Ed didn't seem to have a worry in the world. Dexter, on the other hand, seemed to have a lot of them. Sometimes he wished he could be more like Ed. Ed, what will you do if Good Burger gets closed down? He asked curiously. You know, if the sauce doesn't pass the test? Oh, the sauce will pass. I've been helping it study. Uh-huh. Right. But you know, just what if? What if it doesn't pass? Isn't there anything else you'd like to do? Ed chewed his lower lip thoughtfully. No. Really? Dexter was a little surprised. There was a bunch of stuff that he wanted to do, and he was a little scared that he would never get the chance. Don't you ever feel like there's a whole world out there to see, new places to go to and new stuff to do? You know, travel around and get into adventures like in the movies? Don't you ever feel like that? Ed thought again. I don't know. Do they have good burgers there? That's the point, Ed. I don't know if they have good burgers there. He flopped to the ground in frustration. I've never been there. I've always been right here. Whoa, me too, Ed answered excitedly. What a coinkydink. Dexter took a deep breath and then began to try and explain. He explained that he liked his job at Good Burger, but sometimes he felt like he'd be there forever. He explained how, when he was younger, his mom had bought him a map of the world and all his life. He would look at it and hope that someday, somehow, he could go to all those faraway places. They talked late into the night. Dexter told Ed about all his hopes and dreams. Ed told Dexter about his pants and his moldy bread collection. The stars glowed brightly over their heads, even the ones that looked like Ed's armpit. Later that night, in a far richer section of a far bigger town, another Hopper had come up with a plan. Harry Hopper was Lawrence Hopper Ill's only nephew, the only heir to Lawrence's fortune. But that wasn't good enough for Harry. He was tired of waiting for his inheritance. He wanted it now, and he wanted it bad enough to do something about it. Harry Hopper's long, thin face was set off by a small line of hair that looked like a dead caterpillar perched on his upper lip. His long mouth seemed to stretch twice the length of his face, and it constantly looked as if he had just smelled something bad. His eyes were narrow little slits that made him look like he was constantly squinting. The word best used to describe him was thin. His face was thin, his eyes were thin, his body was thin. Even his teeth were thin. His hair was retreating back on his head, and it came to a point right in the middle of his forehead, like some kind of neon hair sign that pointed to his face to announce, "Bad guy here." Harry Hopper tugged at his pencil-thin black mustache and turned his tiny slitted eyes to Morley, his evil assistant. "Uncle Lawrence will be here in a few days. Is everything ready?" he asked. Morley's round face widened into an evil grin, exposing his sharp yellow teeth. It wasn't a pretty sight. He looked up with his large bug eyes. "Everything is ready, Mr. Harry. When your uncle gets here, he will be in for a big surprise." Morley laughed his evil laugh and rubbed his evil little hands together. The plan was set. Chapter 3. Marcus Finkler was not a happy person. He was not happy for a lot of reasons. He was not happy because he could never find a shoe that fit quite right. He was not happy because the poetry that he wrote quietly on the side had just been rejected by its 131st publisher. The rejection was bad enough, but what made it even worse was the note that was attached to the rejection letter. The note read simply, "You stink." And even worse than that was the fact that "you stink" was clearly the nicest thing that anyone had ever said about his poetry. But mostly Marcus Finkler was not happy because he hated sauce. He hated smelling sauce. He hated tasting sauce. But even more than that, he hated inspecting sauce. This was too bad, really, since inspecting sauce was his job and had been for 15 years. Marcus Finkler stood in front of Good Burger's average little building. He caught his skinny reflection in the dingy front window and straightened his wide plaid tie. He ran his hands through his thinning blonde hair. He looked up at the plastic burger and frowned. "I bet this place looks better in the dark," he thought to himself as he pushed his way in through the overage little door. "I'm Connie Muldoon," announced a woman with a thick Wisconsin accent. Connie Muldoon loved saying her name and tried to work it into every sentence. Her big hair, peeled high atop her head, was sprayed into gravity-defying submission. "Welcome to Connie Muldoon, home of the Connie Muldoons. Can I take your order?" asked Ed politely. After all, he was just doing his job. He wasn't doing it well, but he was doing it. "No, I'm Connie Muldoon. This is Good Burger." "Good Burger," the woman tried to correct him. Ed scratched his eyebrow in contemplation before grabbing the microphone in front of him. "2 good burgers. That'll be $8. "But I want no good burgers," Connie pleaded with him. One merely commented that we were in Good Burger. 2 more good burgers. "Stop it. You've now incorrectly ordered 4 good burgers. That's more good burgers than a Muldoon can eat." Connie Muldoon was really getting frustrated now. It seemed like every time she came into Good Burger there was always a problem. Unfortunately for her, it was the only fast food restaurant in walking distance from her house, and, as her father always told her, the Muldoons didn't believe in the motor vehicles. "I'm sorry," Ed said apologetically, "but I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "I will not leave. I'm Connie Muldoon, and I've been coming here for years. Now I demand good service, or I will speak to your good manager." Ed blinked a few times, then shrugged. "Welcome to Good Burger, home of the Good Burger. Can I take your order?" "Why, that's more like it. Yes, you may take my order. I'm Connie Muldoon, and I would like several packages of your tasty good ketchup." "Several packages of good ketchup," Ed repeated into the mic. That'll be $8. Connie looked stunned, then uncertain, then upset. $8 for good ketchup. Isn't that a bit high?" Ed shook his head, his dreads swinging cheerfully in front of him. "No," he said as he sprung to the countertop in front of Connie. "This is a bit high. Look at me, everyone, I'm way up high," he called gleefully. Marcus Finkler watched Ed climb on the counter. He watched Connie Muldoon storm out. He even watched Ed stick fries in his nose and begin to sing a song about dudes that made Marcus Finkler very unhappy. "Pardon me, can I speak to your manager?" Mr. Finkler asked as he braved his way to the counter. "It's okay with me. You should really check with him, though, don't you think?" Ed responded helpfully. Finkler cringed. This wasn't making him happy. Maybe the sauce would be really bad, and he wouldn't have to pass it. That might make him a little happier. But just a little. What made Mr. Bailey happy was how sparkling clean Good Burger's bathroom was at that moment. His mother would have been proud. He had been waiting for the sauce inspector all day and wanted to make sure everything was perfect. He had inspected the counters. They were all clean. He had inspected the grills. They were all grilling. Now he was inspecting the bathrooms. They were as spotless as bathrooms could be. His one final concern was making sure that the sauce inspector stayed clear of Ed. Maybe he'd give Ed the rest of the day off just to play it safe. Mr. Bailey gave the bathroom one final approving glance, stepped out the door, and began to panic. There, in front of him, was Ed and the sauce inspector. Together. And that couldn't be good. "But I'm the sauce inspector!" the sauce inspector yelled at Ed. Ed started to respond, but Mr. Bailey's hand suddenly clamped down over his mouth, so that all he could manage to get out was, oof, unga, oof. Mr. Bailey plastered on his biggest smile, wiped the panic sweat from his forehead with his free hand, and positioned himself in front of Ed. "Hi, I'm Mr. Bailey, the manager. You must be the sauce inspector. Why don't I show you to the back?" Before Mr. Finkler could respond, Mr. Bailey clutched an arm tightly around him and whisked him away on a non-stop whirlwind tour of the kitchen. He dragged Marcus Finkler by the deep fryer, quickly muttered, "Deep fryer," into Marcus's ear, tightened his grip on Marcus's shoulder, and pulled him onto the next appliance. Finally, they reached the large stainless steel refrigerator that sat quietly humming to itself against the very back wall. This was the heart of Good Burger, the holy place where they stored the good beef and where the good fries were kept frozen before being fried and served. But most importantly, this was where they kept their secret weapon. This was where they kept the Ed sauce. Mr. Bailey grabbed the cold metal handle and proudly yanked the door open. And then he seriously began to panic. The pot of Ed's sauce was empty.